Don't go away. I'm sure the questions are lining up. All right, go to it.
When you talk about the Islamic world, are you taking into account the different Muslim cultures around the world, such as those represented in Jordan, Israel, the United States, Iraq, Turkey, etc., and their varying views of interpretation on the Quran, which in effect changes the ideologies of those certain groups and cultures?
Well, sure, that's a very huge question, but there are several considerations we can have about it. There are obviously these immigrant communities all over the world. There is no country where there are no Muslims. And so when I speak about the Islamic world, I do mean to include them, yes. And there are several considerations about this. One is there are varying interpretations of the Quran, and there are varying interpretations of Islamic law. There are actually 4 schools of Sunni Muslim jurisprudence. The Sunnis are 85 to 90% of Muslims worldwide, and they are mostly the ones in the countries that you mentioned. I believe Jordan, Israel, the United States, and where? Turkey. Yeah, most overwhelmingly Sunni populations. There are 4 schools of Islamic law for Sunnis, and most every Sunni Muslim adheres to the view of Islam, the understanding of the Quran that is taught by one or the other of these schools, the Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, and Hanbali. Now, each one of those schools they all agree that it is part of the responsibility of the Islamic Ummah, the community, which is not just a set of nations, but is anybody who identifies himself as a Muslim, collectively, wherever he may be. It is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community to wage war against unbelievers in order to either convert them to Islam or subjugate them as inferiors under the rule of Islamic law. Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, taught that you first invite non-Muslims to convert. If they refuse that, then you invite them to accept the second-class status, the dhimma, the contract of protection. And third, if they refuse both of those, to go to war with them. These things are taught by all 4 Sunni schools, as well as by the Shiites. So on that, there's no disagreement. Now, does that mean that every Muslim in the world is pursuing this? Certainly not. There's a spectrum of belief, knowledge, and fervor among Muslims, as there is among any community that identifies itself by any name. And certainly if you consider yourself Christians or Jews or Hindus or Buddhists, that really doesn't tell us anything much more about what you actually think about things than we knew before. Because there are so many different ways, so many different levels of knowledge, levels of understanding, levels of commitment among people who identify themselves by those terms. So there's a remarkable variation in that regard, but on the other hand, a remarkable unanimity in terms of the teachings themselves. And that makes the peaceful Muslims an ever-fertile recruiting ground for the more radicalized ones, because they're able to point to chapter and verse and say, this is your responsibility as a believer, you have to do this. And they're able to convince people that way. This happened in several notable cases in the United States, where very nominal believers were approached by jihadist recruiters who were able to convince them on the basis of the texts of the Quran and Islamic law and tradition that this was part of their religious responsibility. And so I think that while it is true there are many interpretations and people in many states in life, we have to realistically understand that there is no community, I should emphasize that there's no sect of Islam that is considered orthodox by the rest that has ever renounced the ideology of violent jihad or the subjugation of non-Muslims. And until that happens, these things can always be used to incite people to violence as they're being used today. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you just answered part of my question, but I was just going to ask you to comment on the issue of interpretation. And sometimes we hear that, yes, you can go find certain verses in the Quran that teach one thing, but it's just a certain group of people interpret that radically, just like there may be verses in the Bible which, taken out of context, could teach something totally different than Christians practice. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's very important to understand that anything, any text can be interpreted any way anybody wants, really. But we need to be aware of how Muslims themselves have interpreted it. In the Quran, very briefly, there are 2 major divisions of the Quran. That is the Meccan verses and the Medinan verses. Muhammad started out in Mecca. He taught tolerance and peace generally. And later he moved to Medina, another city in Arabia. He became, for the first time, a military leader as well as a prophet. And he began to teach warfare against unbelievers. Now, if you read the Muslim commentaries, the principal Muslim commentaries on the Quran, Ibn Kathir, Ibn Juzai, the Tafsir al-Jalalain, as-Suyuti, as including the 20th century jihad theorists like Sayyid Qutb and Maududi and others, you will find that they will generally say that the Medinan verses, because they come later, take precedence over and cancel out what comes earlier. This is bad news for non-Muslims because, unfortunately, the violent parts are all in the later part of the book, chronologically. But the understanding is that where there is a disagreement, what comes later chronologically cancels what's earlier, and that therefore warfare against unbelievers is the Quran's last word on jihad. This is a mainstream Islamic understanding of this. I can give you plenty of references for this. Actually, you can find them in the book and elsewhere.